Okay, so here we go. This is Francoise Pfaff from his book, The Cinema of Ousmane Sembene, a pioneer of African film from 1984. This is the second chapter in the book, Sembene, a Griot of Modern Times. So, what is the basic claim of the chapter? Pfaff is basically suggesting that Sembene, his kind of crucial role in African cinema and world cinema would be the fact that he's a figure that basically has an analog to kind of regional, traditional African culture of this figure of the griot, right? And partially, right, like we kind of have to understand where Pfaff is coming from, because he's basing it on Sembene's own statements that's what Sembene himself kind of figures him, his role as. But that's part of also, I think, the kind of critical key that we don't want to kind of miss is that Sembene is I'm going to suggest and think that he probably knows exactly what he's doing. He knows how a statement like that will resonate or sort of like move through the culture, and in that kind of self-positioning. What I'm saying is that I don't think we need to take that literally, that statement, or entirely at face value either. I think there's more going on. And what I'm trying to get at is that Sembene probably knows exactly what he's doing when he makes a statement like that, right? I mean, any of us do when we kind of do that kind of work of trying to project or even sort of like put out the narrative of this is who I am, this is what my work is. And I think that, I guess again, to kind of follow up on what I was previously saying, I think Pfaff, he would have benefited from maybe kind of being a little bit more thoughtful. Maybe that's a little bit unfair, but I guess that's my line and I'm sticking to it. Okay, so with the griot, right? Like a lot of what we're talking about here, right, is the kind of the sort of melding and mixture of modern and pre-modern traditions, right? And this is one, again, like just from the very get-go, and we're talking about like the first page, something that's kind of missed because we're talking about something that's like specifically regional, right? We're talking about the specificity of Africa, right? And in the case of Sembene, Senegal. But on the first page, there is this kind of a critical etymology, right? And what I mean by that is that if we look at the origins of the word, right, and we kind of use our critical faculties to kind of think about the etymology and the origins of the word, that's when sort of like these kind of bigger implications, historical implications, but also kind of theoretical concerns or even ethical or political concerns start to emerge. And what I mean by that is that where does it come from? Well, for one, they're not totally sure, right? It's just not documented well enough. But there are two versions according to Pfaff. Well, actually it's not Pfaff, it's according to Georges Ballandier and Jacques Mackay. I'm probably butchering all these pronunciations, but just please look the other way. Portuguese, right? Or French, right? Like, what does that tell you? So, I mean, it's already kind of throwing, a giant wrench into Pfaff's argument because, like, he's saying, there's something kind of, if it's not clear, I've already talked about this to a certain degree, but like the idea of authenticity is kind of looming in the background. Now, this is, written in the 80s, before any of you were born. So authenticity wasn't a keyword in the way that it is now, but that's kind of what's going on here. So like he's trying to suggest that Sembene is this kind of uniquely authentic African filmmaker, and he's using like a regional term that has origin where? In Portugal and France, which are what? Colonial powers. So I haven't actually done the research, but I'm going to bet money, right, that this movement of even the term, not necessarily this. I'm not trying to say that the practice necessarily doesn't come from Africa, but at least with the term, there's a suggestion that it's talking about kind of an international flow that's contingent on, the economies of colonialism. That's what I mean by a critical etymology. By taking a second and thinking, like, wait a minute, we're talking about Senegal and Africa, but then you immediately have to go to Portugal and France. Why? Where does that take us? Where do we go from there? And so another thing that I kind of want to sort of point out from off the bat with this sort of critical etymological sort of exercise is this idea of, if we think about like flow and global flow, international flow, so the flow of the movement of a term like griot, right, which might either have a Portuguese or a French kind of origin to it, like, is there, I'm going to suggest, of course, there is, but I'll put it this way, there might be a benign flow or even a benevolent flow, right? So this would be an example. I would hope to a certain degree, to a high degree, that when I put this on the internet and I give it to you, it's moving across the country, it's moving across the world, that's coming from good faith. I'm trying to kind of continue our conversation. This is for our mutual growth, right? But in a similar sense, flow cannot be ahistorical, flow cannot be apolitical. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, how much of kind of like cultural flow or any type of flow movement do we tend to think of as neutral or apolitical, but in fact has a sort of, sometimes a very tricky and troubling, sort of history to it. So, and that's again, selling the endeavor of we have to be vigilant, we have to be rigorous about these sort of things, right? But so, like, what is the griot? Basically, it's this idea of the orator, right? Specifically of like the idea of oral tradition, right? And, this is already sort of, like, this idea is a very kind of like pre-modern idea, right? Like pre-modern culture, which again, like regional pre-modern culture. But this is often, like, this is a sort of idea that's invoked to, suggest a sort of long tradition, sometimes even like a pre-modern or ancient tradition, right? So there's like a genealogy, right? That like this is something that's been done for a very long time, right? Really want to touch my eyeball right now, but I won't. I mean, like really actually get into the eyeball. But the kind of it's curious, right? And this is where the sort of tension is emerging in thinking about Sembene as a griot, and even in a sort of self-configuration as a griot, right? Is that if we have this kind of pre-modern tradition of oration, right? It's in tension, right, with the kind of decidedly modern tradition of 20th century, culture of visuality. Right. Even text, right? Like you have to read text, right? Of course, there are ways that you don't have to read text, but predominantly, right? And this is an interesting kind of interesting sort of tension between that goes between the two, right? So it's like simultaneously both modern and pre-modern, right? Is what this kind of figuration does. At the same time. And I'll get into it a little bit further in a bit. This is a claim that I'm not a kind of huge fan of. And just to kind of like, I guess to give you a sense of why, just straight off, is this can be used so many times in a sort of essentialist way. And to kind of prop up or prioritize certain, let's say, aspects of culture. Like, for example, he brings it up too, but like the ideas of like the way that like this is tied with like something like myths, right? But it becomes this thing where it's like as if, you know, especially it's because it's not just like it's not that it's oration or oral tradition as such, right? For example, it's not just like, let's put it this way, when they're talking about oral tradition, you know, what's being passed down through this tradition is usually it's like the idea of like stories and storytelling. And oftentimes I think that this is a kind of lazy way that we sort of suggest that narrative is somehow like hardwired into like the human condition, right? That we need stories, that we need storytelling, that this is the way, and this is what I mean by essentialist, because this is the way that it's always been, that is also a suggestion that that's the way that it always should be. And if you, I mean, you guys know me, I don't like those kind of claims, right? Because, you know, it's closing off the possibility of other things. Just because something has been done, you know, a way doesn't mean that it's the correct way, right? Same thing with, you know, like colonialism would be like a claim where, you know, like, well, we've always colonized other places. Like, yeah, that doesn't mean it's right. And I know that might seem like a huge jump, but as we've already learned from someone like Edward Said, it's precisely in those kind of banal places, right? Well, storytelling is that's something that's essential. You know, that's something that we've always done. That's precisely something like colonialism is hidden, because those stories are about colonialism, right? They're precisely about barbarians and the kind of the enlightened liberators, right? Okay, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But yes, you know, just in general, this is another kind of reminder to sort of just be careful of essentialism, basically. Or, like, at least I would put it that way, you know, because in the spirit of the class, you know, if you are going to make an essentialist argument, just know that there are kind of critical dimensions to it that would make one hesitate. So if you're going to use it, like, use it with caution, is, I guess, you know, just don't, is what I would say, because it gets into really kind of ugly territory.